Well, when I was a little boy sitting on...
Hello, welcome to Going Deeper. My name is Marcie Sclove, and today I'm sitting with Melissa Giraud. Melissa is the co-founder and co-director of EmbraceRace, a community of adults supporting each other to raise a generation of kids who are brave, informed, and proactive on matters of race and racial justice. So we will learn more about what all that means, but welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Marcie.
Thanks for coming. I like to start by kind of setting the whole foundation, the whole, like, the soil of your life in a certain way. What in your childhood, in your, your growing years, informed how you live, but also this work that you're doing, this important work?
Right, it's a good question. Yeah, we all come from a different racial experience. We all have one, and position. And mine was, and continues to be, that I am multiracial. I am the child of immigrants. And my mother is from French Canada. My father's from a little island called Dominica. So I'm a black-white mix. And I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts in a Puerto Rican neighborhood in the North End. Oh. And so all of those experiences of being, going there and also eventually going to a private school that was mostly more affluent and whiter than my neighborhood, all of those experiences really shaped my understanding of how race works in the US. And of course, part of it is I'm a multiracial person who can sometimes pass, as a white person. So being able to have the privilege of walking around like this, but also have some of the experiences of in my family or in my neighborhood, knowing, for example, that neighborhood schools is not always a good thing. Some neighborhoods are disinvested in, and oftentimes, in fact, that's a term that's used to keep people out. Right. So yeah, that was really the reason. So
in your family, like your mom's family from Canada, French Canada, are you connected and close to that side of your family?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, yeah.
And within the white, black, the mixing of these two families, did that go well? Was that easy?
It did. I mean, what's funny is that my father's family mostly, I had some cousins who lived nearby in Connecticut, so an uncle and some cousins, so we would see them a bunch, but mostly that family, his family was still in Dominica or sort of spread out, England, aunt in California, that kind of thing. And we saw the Canadian relatives a bit more because they could just drive down. And my father tells the story of meeting my grandfather for the first time, going up to see them outside, an hour out of Montreal, and meeting this sort of farmer dude. And he says, "Where are you from?" And my dad says, "Dominica." And he's like, "Where's Dominica?" It's, it's an island in the Caribbean, and I'm a mix of French and African. And my grandfather was like, "Oh," like he just had no idea. He could have been from Mars,
Yeah, but the French, did that make a connection with your mom's father, your grandfather?
Yeah.
That there was this French connection?
That, I don't really, it's funny, I don't really know. Dominique is an interesting island. It's got this whole history that it was colonized by the French and then colonized by the British, so they speak English, but they have these French last names. So there's sort of a lineage that's part French, but it certainly wasn't my dad's first language.
I see. So also probably the identification with the French.
You don't think of French of color. I mean, a lot of people don't. I certainly do now. But at the time, in his context, French was pretty white. So I think it was just like, whoa. Confusing, I think. But not in a bad way. What's interesting is that the generation after my mother's generation, sort of my cousins who are a bit older, they're the ones who had more exposure to TV and world news and, you know, developed more active stances on race, you know, and could tend to be a bit more racist.
Wow. These were still Canadians.
Yeah, yeah. It's just, I think, you know, my grandfather, they grew up in a very rural, they didn't have TV, they didn't have cars, you know, it was just a different time.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many layers of cross race, but also culture and country and, you know, just a lot to unpack in all of that.
Well, even that, the reason my parents met is sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Which is that my mother was a dietitian in a French-speaking hospital in Montreal, and my dad was practicing to be a doctor, and he had a hard time finding. He was sent to school by the church in Dominica because he was sort of an orphan, so he was sent to school at a Catholic university in the United States, Iona College in New York, and then it was hard to pass the medical exams because you're not used to taking them. So they sent him to these Belgian priests who lived in Dominica, sent him to Belgium for medical school, where everyone could get in, but it was very hard to stay.
Yeah.
And he got through there and then went to another French-speaking hospital, which is where he met my mother.
Oh.
So it's all kind of crazy the way the colonial aspect, you know, sort of has a hand, as do these.
And that your father was a doctor,
right,
is another aspect.
It's another aspect.
Because there was the whole class thing.
Right. That's a really important one, which it took me a while to figure out, I think, because, you know, it's very different. The class structure is very different among people of color in the States, you know. So if you say a black doctor or a doctor of color, or if you say black middle class, it's a very different. It doesn't assume, you know, it doesn't assume the same things.
Can you say more? Because I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah. There've been a lot of really interesting articles about this recently, and looking at neighborhoods and especially segregation, and around how if you're a, you know, sort of working class white person, you're more likely to have access to good schools than a middle to upper class black person.
Okay.
And why is that? And it's because of where we live. You know, so yeah.
But also, if you are a family of color and you live where there is a good school, that doesn't mean you're protected from the racism in that good school that your kids are going to experience.
Right. So there's all kinds of access issues. Some are more clear. We don't live in the neyborhood. You know, we've got these neighborhood schools, and we're going to have to, we could be making, I mean, it's really kind of incredible if you look at, there's a great New York Times article about this, about Black Americans who choose to live in, you know, segregated Black neighborhoods, and just the sacrifices, you know? So there's that aspect, but there's also who are the schools built for, what does the curriculum look like, if you go, you know, you live in, I mean, I want to say Amherst, but that's a little bit political. you sort of, wherever you live, if the school is sort of built, most schools are not, you know, built for especially Black Americans, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of the curriculum, the books that are available, and the teacher population, there's not a lot of mentorship. So it's big. It's big. It's big. There's a lot of access issues, and then there's also the whole sort of network stress. So if you know, of course, there are more poor white Americans than there are poor people of color, largely because there's so many more white Americans. So the percentage is smaller, but there's so many. So I don't want to say that that's not true and devastating and all of that. However, it's much more likely if you're a middle class or upper class Black person in America, or Hispanic person, that you will be supporting a lot of your family. You know, so there's network stress. You know, so that if something, it's not sort of, and that you got there almost by accident where you are. It's jumped classes and you're supporting, just a lot of nieces and nephews and uncle, and you're doing
Sure.
a lot of that. So there's a lot of network stress. So if something goes wrong, it's more likely to kind of fall apart, and there's less, there's less wealth being built up.
That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah, less ownership of property.
Right. Yeah.
About the segregation of schools, so one of my first interviews was with Julius Lester, and I was re-listening to it recently, and he talked about, so he died in 2018, and he was 76, so he was in schools in the 40s, late 40s. He talked about the positive aspects of segregation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And how, in a way, that created this group of activists who went into the civil rights movement as with really good self-esteem and really good understanding of what their position in white America was.
Right.
And even though the buildings were crappy and but the teachers were good and motivated and teachers of color. And so that also made me think about the positive aspects of segregation, not to say we should go back there or that I, in any way think that it was a good idea generally, but that given adversity, it did provide some positive qualities that then ended up really making a difference in the country. Right.
That was certainly not the case by the time I got to school, because there was, what's interesting about the integration process in the U.S. that happened, it was forced to happen in the South and it happened sort of differently and wasn't forced to happen in the North, is that a lot of teachers of color, a lot of black teachers were put out of work. Because if we're going to integrate, we're certainly not, you're not going to teach my kid, that kind of thing. So there was a real decimation of the teacher workforce, of black teachers in particular. And there wasn't, and then there was sort of more opportunity, some opportunities, for Black Americans, for people of color, especially in the middle upper class. So that people who might have taught in segregated spaces were, suddenly being offered things in white dominant spaces, so that there was some creaming that happened. So both of those things, meant that by the 80s, I was growing up in the 80s, Ronald Reagan's America, where there was major disinvestment and a real backlash against kind of 60s, 70s politics. So we weren't seeing those benefits, and I can see there's still, every time I say we need integrated schools, there are always people of color, as well as white people, who say, no, but things were better when, but we've just moved in a different direction. And it's always true that you can never, separate is never equal, because we don't invest as much. Right now, the school, in my neighborhood school in Springfield, is a 1 on great schools. Great schools is the system that a lot of people use to decide where they're going to live. You can be a 1 to a 10.
And 10's the best?
And it's a 1. Wow. And that has actually, that whole internet system has really, of rating schools, largely by test scores, has really hyper segregated schools
so
in the modern day.
So another way, institutionally, things get in the structural way really affected.
And testing really affected that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I'm here with not all good news, Marcie.
No, that's okay. We're unpacking. That's what we're doing. Okay, so let's fast forward to this work that you and your husband Andrew are doing, EmbraceRace. Did it start when your daughters became humans? It really did. It did. It started when one was in. We started in 2016. So in early 2016, before we thought Trump would be president. Wow. But so we clearly felt a need, and then Trump became president, and boy, did people come out of the woodwork. Both because they were suffering or because they suddenly saw this was a problem. But
yeah, we had young daughters at the time. We still have young daughters. They're 9 and 11 now. Maybe the year before that, we'd been at a preschool. We were very involved in our daughter's preschool, and we started a race and parenting group at the Common School, actually, with a group of parents.
Full disclosure, we're both from Amherst, Massachusetts. We're here in Greenfield, but I just wanted to say.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. I was like coming out. I didn't realize coming out. Right. We live in Amherst, Massachusetts. So we were at this preschool, and there was a diversity committee of parents, and we were working on school stuff, how to get more people, of color in, scholarships, curriculum, that kind of thing. And we weren't working. A lot of diversity committees do this. They work on the mechanisms of the school and aren't working particularly on, what am I struggling with as a parent and my kids' exposure to racial stuff, right? But we started talking on the sidelines, and really, my daughter, wants straight hair, or my child seems to prefer, kids who look like XYZ, just these concerns that parents have. And decided, this is what we should really be doing. Let's start a race and parenting group. So we started one, and the school opened up the doors to us and opened up childcare, and it was wonderful, and we had this amazing experience, and then realized that in organizing for that meeting, we realized with several other parents that there weren't a lot of resources for parents. There's a lot of resources on racial development from an academic perspective, but really not for parents, and really not for parents with kids of color for the most part. And so we realized this gap, and then we had this meeting, and I don't think we came away with, that's what we do, like great epiphanies, but we just felt, we're reminded something that we knew intellectually, which was that everyone's experiencing this because it's in the water. It's where it's the state of things, right? So it's not that I'm an awful parent because my child is coming home and saying certain things. It's really this smog that Beverly Daniels Tatum talks about that is affecting all of us. So so that made us think. We had that great time, and but realized also not only are there no resources, but it's very hard for parents, especially parents with young kids, to ever meet, to have a space to meet. And the school was just open to us that one time. So we said, oh gosh, we really need a place to go at 2 a.m, when you're struggling. So we proceeded to create this online community.
I think for me, researching to get going for the interview, one of the things that really stands out is just the educational aspect of knowing how young kids are affected by race issues. Right. And that it isn't when they're older, it's really when they're young.
I mean, it's 6 months, this research, 3 to 6 months, that kids react much better to other adults who have the same race, with the same as their caregivers. And then as you get older, as early as in the 3 to 5 range, kids are actually, making decisions based on sort of in-group, out-group.
Yes.
So that's really young, and yet the tradition so far has been, in this country, oftentimes has been in a public way to talk to teenagers at high school, to have more of a sort of civil rights and racial curriculum in those years, when it's, pretty late.
And then also when young kids mention it, to say, oh no, don't, that's rude, don't bring up that someone has brown skin, or.
It's really amazing. We've been actually, even today, we have this partnership going with the Carl Museum, where
Eric Carl.
We're creating they're the Carl Museum of the Picture Book, and we're doing a video and workshop project called Reading Race in Picture Books, where we're using picture books as a tool to have conversations about race.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and what's been so interesting is I was just watching some of the video earlier, and there's video of the various children's book authors are in it, and various educators. And so often when an educator asks a kid, what do you see in this picture? What else do you see? Describe the people in the picture. And it really doesn't matter if the group is, a mixed group or a white group or, an all group of color. Kids really still hesitate to name race or to name skin color. And kids are really, my kids still, and they're older, will tell me, everything they ate today and everything someone told them and their favorite, just full of details. But they kind of learn pretty early that we're not supposed to talk about those details, which is not the right message. Right. Yeah.
And it's so layered. I was grateful to be able to witness a family of color talking with their teenager, and she mentioned how she had been stopped in the hallway by the guard, the hall guard, accusing her of vandalizing a bathroom or something multiple times. And as the parents responded, I saw her backing down like, it's okay. I found ways to hide from the hall guard. I became friends with the hall guard. She's not doing it so much. And the parents' reactivity made her uncomfortable, and like she didn't want them to respond. So there's another layer of how much do the kids share with their parents, no matter how close.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's very complex to figure that piece out as well.
They don't want to stand out. They have some
and they don't want their
embarrassment.
parents to embarrass them.
Right, we're very embarrassing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One of the things, you're talking about ways that race is presented, and one of the things I saw was your Huffington Post article about the white dolls on the shelf together, using Beverly Tatum's title. And it reminded me of this game that we played when my daughter was little called Guess Who? I think that's, Guess Who? And it was a pop-up game, and you would match faces. And in each, there were categories of 5 sort of unusual characteristics. So 5 people with eyeglasses, 5 people with mustaches, 5 people of color who all looked white, 5 women, just so bizarre. And we used it as a tool to talk about how messed up that was. And I did notice, because I looked online, that the game looks like it has been improved.
Oh, good,
it's not, I thought, did they go out of business? No, they improved it. But that seems like one of the avenues with little kids to have the conversation.
There's so many opportunities to have the conversation.
Say more about examples of that.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. There are so many. That game example made me think of Clue, the game Clue. And I had an old version. I used to love to play Clue, and I had a very old version. And I would call it to my kids, it's the white version. It's a very old version, and there was one supposedly exotic person who's an Asian woman, and she was dressed different than everyone else was white, I don't know if you ever played Clue.
Oh, definitely. But I'm trying to think which one was she? Miss Peacock?
Miss...
That's okay. It doesn't matter.
Miss Scarlet, I think.
Miss Scarlet,
And of course she was Scarlet, so there was also the kind of, those implications. But I couldn't find the old Clue, so I said, we'll get a new Clue. That was the white Clue, and I went and got it and brought it home, and my kids said, "Mommy, this is the white Clue too," because it's still the white Clue. Like the characters are still majority white. So, and it was created I looked at the date on it, and it was maybe 2006 or something. So quite remarkable. But but there are those, we sort of joke. That was a joke, but there are a lot of things in any media. People always ask us, what movies kids should be seeing, and they go to Common Sense Media to get their recommendations. And I don't find that Common Sense or anywhere that I've seen has a great filter on race. There is kind of a gender filter, but really not great on race. So what you end up doing is watching all these problematic movies because there aren't enough movies that really feature characters of color that tell their story sort of in a positive way. So a lot of, I twist my girl's hair every so often, and we end up watching a lot of TV while that's being done. And there are so many, like Disney is a great, you might say don't watch Disney, but actually it's a great way to sort of talk about these problematic. There was one episode recently where my kids love this show, Liv and Maddie. It's like these teenage twins, and there's, every episode there's a problem, but it's also very funny, and the comic timing is great.
It's a comic.
Yes, it's for kids. No, it's real people.
Okay.
And this, one of the main characters, who's a basketball player, she meets this very tall black man and says, you need to be on my basketball team, because she wanted to win her tournament. And so she invites him, he says yes, and then they go to play, and he doesn't know how to play basketball. And she says, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have chosen you just because you're tall. And my kids and I are looking at each other and just laughing, and because there's no other black person in the show, like there's something else about, so this is now, and just that continually sort of happens in these shows. Yeah, a lot of problems.
But because you are already in your household so fluid about speaking about these things, your girls are already having that critical lens that they anticipate. Okay, what are they going to say?
Yeah.
That's what the goal is of Embrace Race in a certain way.
It is, and I think it's the goal of critical literacy. It's very hard for parents to find time to watch things and read things with their kids, and there's a lot of times that we can't do that. But we need to make time to do it sometimes in order to just give them those lenses. I'm very grateful that my kids have those lenses, although they're not always grateful.
Sure. Well, when they grow up, they will be.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
So can you say a little more just about the whole structure of Embrace Race? It's online. There's webinars.
Right.
Tell some of the
so we
nuts
think,
and bolts.
the way we think about it is we're still, again, it's been almost 4 years, and we're still we're not doing everything that we envision, but we're getting there. And so far, we think of it as a place where we're building community around to have these conversations around racial learning, of our kids, and our own experiences that inform how we raise our kids. So there's building that community, and then there's also curating and creating resources so that there's so much great research out there, not on everything. Sometimes we have to go with experience and best practices and the wisdom of the crowd, sometimes. But there is actual research, and just like in education or lots of fields, a lot of times that research doesn't get used or doesn't get implemented. There's like a chasm between sort of what we know and how we practice. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, is really bring those tools, bring those experts to these monthly conversations, these monthly webinars, we have these action guides, which we used to call tip sheets, that distill a lot of what this means you can do in your life with your kid. We have a presence on social media, mostly on Facebook, which is really we post quite a lot, and it's really a place to have conversations and to...
So people just bring their own experience. Anecdotally, this is my kid said this. Is it that kind of thing?
Not so much. It's more, also a place to learn. So it's posting kind of recent articles about many different aspects that affect many different groups, right? And some are opinions, and then we have conversations about them online. So that's a great place too, if you want to follow and just get a regular diet of sort of, sort of a racial lens. I think EmbraceRace on Facebook is a great place to go and do that. But we've also got a lot of things that we're, like this program with the Carl, that we're working on.
You know, I was looking at your website, which is really great, by the way. And so there's the articles,
right?
There's the webinars, there's a few videos,
right? There's these action guides, these tip sheets. There's some children's book. There's a children's book section to get people using those tools a bit, and that'll be built out a bit more.
So you're able to sort of reach out to a certain kind of family that's online and savvy about how to do online stuff at 2 in the morning.
That's true. Yep.
Is there a way that you're also able to reach out to communities that aren't online?
Yeah. I wasn't going to mention, but now that you respond, that so we've got this sort of the 3 buckets of our work: community, resources, and the third is partnerships. And so the way, because we're actually such a small organization, that we reach other people is to partner with organizations. You know, we're in developing partnerships with across the country with organizations like WISE and
Big Brothers Big Sisters.
That would be a great one too. Or we have a partnership. We're working on something with the American Psychological Association, so that's getting at exposing more therapists to this work, and we have relationships with the American Association of Pediatrics. So we're really trying to distribute widely and also get these folks of varying expertise and experience to come in and help with the resources, and then to spread them in person to their community groups. So it's sort of supporting work that's already being done and groups that already exist, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That makes me really happy
That's
too,
a great question.
because then you're educating people who could otherwise have an ill effect.
Right,
and
do harm.
To do harm.
Right.
Not meaning to.
Yeah.
Maybe. And instead can really have an impact that is positive.
Right, and we actually did. This was great. We had, I don't know if I told you this, that the American Association of Pediatrics had made a statement that said racism is actually bad for children's health and explained all the ways that it manifests in the body. And because we've been in conversations with them, this is in the New York Times, they interviewed someone and they mentioned EmbraceRace, like that EmbraceRace.
Wonderful.
If you want resources to help you with this, go to the AAP or go to EmbraceRace.
Wow. So that's the other piece, is that you are not just a local little place, you are a national place. And I love that you were on the NPR radio program, On Point, on Martin Luther King Day.
Right, that was quite an honor,
And some of the other media things on your website are quite impressive. These articles that you mentioned, or articles that you guys have written.
Thank you.
So that's really important. I also really want to stress that it's really important for white families and white kids. I'm glad you're stressing that. That it can confuse people, because one of the things that's not happening enough in the U.S. is these conversations across race. We're having conversations with people like us, but how much are we trying to do the work across race, and really not just, and I'm not just saying across white, non-white, I'm saying across Black, Latino, across Asian. I mean, we're really bumping up against each other, and the idea that people of color are, all get along and have the same position, is just so funny. This idea that we're going to take over. It's like, no, we're actually not. White people are still the plurality. And racially, at least, sort of have more in common than this vast array.
you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a good segue to this event that I was happy to be at Eric Carle Museum. Your first of hopefully many story slams, or whatever you call it.
No slamming, but
no slamming.
yeah.
Story. What?
It's a storytelling event.
Storytelling event.
Yeah, and the theme was I See Color. Yeah.
And on the flip.
Right.
Is that in relation to like on the flip side?
Yeah, it's sort of counter story, like a counter story.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was that event. Again, we don't, like you were saying, we're a national organization, and we get asked to do a lot of local stuff, and there are so many great organizations doing work locally, and we'd like to do it, but we sort of can't always do both. So this was an opportunity, and we do that work as residents and, as parents and all of that.
Sure.
But as EmbraceRace, we haven't really done so much local work, and it was great to join with, Good Talk Media, a group, with Amherst Media, with the Carl. I'm already forgetting. Oh, with Valley Voices, they do the Story Slam.
That's the slam.
Yeah, to just put on something locally.
Well, and what
That's what On the Flip is the group together.
Oh, okay. What I loved too was, it was a Vietnamese man, a Venezuelan woman, and her amazing daughter, who kind of stole the show.
Yeah, Vietnamese American, but by the way, yeah. I mean, sort of raised here. Yeah.
Vietnamese American.
Raised here, yeah.
Raised here. Venezuelan raised there, but immigrant.
Yeah, right, immigrant, yep.
The Tibetan Hampshire College student.
Yeah.
Who used an interpreter. That was an interesting challenge.
Right.
The white man who started the Movement Voter Project.
Right.
Very
Billy
interesting.
Yep.
And the African American ER, ER doctor.
Right. Yep.
And who else am I missing? Probably some others.
Angelica Castro, who Filipina American.
Yeah.
Who did actually immigrate as well.
But what I loved about it wasn't just black white.
Right. Yeah.
And it wasn't just immigrant.
Right.
It was and there was a Muslim woman from Bangladesh.
Right.
So you really broadened the whole lens about I See Color.
Right.
It's not just about black white skin color or those issues.
It's not so literal yet.
It's not so literal, and it didn't diminish any of those issues. Yeah. But it just really opened.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Opened
it was amazing. I mean, it was really. The reception was really great. People were really hungry for it, and I think Western Mass, is very, and even if we want to be more specific to sort of this Happy Valley area, is really diverse, and we often don't see it because maybe, you don't see it at a town meeting or at a town council meeting or at, in these official capacities. Sometimes you still have really majority white in sort of some of these positions in terms of running for stuff. So somehow we hold this narrative in our heads that, this place is so white, and the actual experience of people of color, I think, and of people like you who've been here for a while, is that the people of color population has grown so significantly. And, in our schools, elementary schools in Amherst, for example, it's 45 and higher kids of color, so we're having a different experience,
but still,
and we find each other.
Yeah.
So our experience is one that's very colorful.
And what's important is that public spaces in town, in events, are just more indicative of that.
That we're bringing in those voices.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to go to that event and say, this area is so white.
Right.
But
at the same time, there's a lot of people, going back to Amherst, which is what we both know, there's a lot of people who still see it as a very progressive white place, which has never been true 100%. But to not realizing all the different schools, languages in the schools, and all the poverty that's there, that's not related necessarily to the race issue, but that there is a lot of poverty in Amherst.
There's overlap,
So,
for sure.
So that's another way that it brings exposure and helps us understand things.
Yeah, I mean, the storytellers were not professional storytellers.
Exactly.
They were reluctant and not, ultimately the ones that were there wanted to be a part of something. But they were just so well received, by the audience.
You could hear a pin drop.
They really felt
just very powerful.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I'm curious about your experiences with NPR.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that I looked up was this this program or this show or this thing that you did, that you produced about Mexico meets the Midwest.
Yeah.
And is it Duranguense?
Duranguense. Yeah.
And that was so interesting.
Wasn't that fascinating?
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about
About Duranguense, yeah.
Well, about that and just your
NPR.
Experience about NPR, doing NPR.
Yeah. Well, I do feel like I've backed into a lot of things, that I haven't had a very straight path, Yeah,
I'm like that too.
Yeah. And so how I got to NPR and to that series that I did was that first I was a teacher, so I was a public school teacher in Chicago in a bilingual program. And I think part of my urge to do that was really about, where I grew up and sort of.
So were you bilingual, Spanish, English?
No.
In your Puerto Rican neighborhood?
No, I really wasn't.
Okay.
I was speaking French with my mother a bit,
Sure.
and then my parents actually lived. My sister was born in Puerto Rico, we did live in this Puerto Rican neighborhood, but I didn't get a ton of it. It was later that when I moved to Chicago and then spent some time in Venezuela and Ecuador, that I learned Spanish and found it very useful in the U.S.
Totally.
As well. So and it was very close to French, so it was really easy for me. So I had that experience, and then. Being, as I taught in Chicago, Ira Glass, who maybe you know, was starting.
This American Life.
Yeah, in Chicago, he was starting to do these. He was on NPR, and he was doing these pieces about schools in Chicago, and how, just how odd they were, and how impoverished some of them were, and they weren't stories about standards or. The fight for, about textbooks or any of these kind of stories that you typically hear on NPR. They were really stories that I remember him talking to a teacher who said, I have to bring in the toilet paper. Like, there's no toilet paper, so I bring it to make sure that my kids have toilet paper. And I was doing that as a teacher, and I just thought, this is what people need to understand. People need to understand this.
Sure.
And that led me into radio, and I went to I was at NPR for years, and it was a big part, sort of formatively, in DC, of my sort of adult kind of education. And after being there for maybe 7 years, I applied for a Corporation for Public Broadcasting grant to go back with my former students and to follow them, trail them, and talk about how things had changed for them. Again, more education stories, but also what did it mean in Chicago that these kids who came in, most of them immigrants themselves, some undocumented, and still undocumented, by the way, who came in and who I was their 4th grade teacher years before, and they were approaching 18 when I did these stories with them, and they were now in a Chicago that was majority people of color, so things had kind of shifted, and what did that mean for sort of how they saw themselves in, the U.S. and compared to sort of back home, what had been back home when they were younger. And it was just a story I could really relate to. And so when I left NPR I ended up doing these stories for NPR that you sort of have to leave to do these documentary stories, and that related to how my kids were,
So you took a leave of absence,
to get a Corporation for Public Broadcasting grant at that time.
It's like a conflict of interest kind of thing?
Yeah,
or?
I mean that you can't like get double paid, and
I
so
see.
yeah, so you get paid and you sell your stuff back to NPR. So that's when I left NPR and did these stories with my former students about things like Duranguense. At the time, there was this huge craze in Chicago of this music from the state of Durango, Mexico, and most of Chicago Mexican Americans were not from, or Mexicans were not from Durango, but there was this mythology about Durango because it was sort of considered the Wild West, and there was a lot of narco trafficking, and John Wayne had a house there, and a lot of his movies were filmed in Durango because it looked like the West.
Yeah.
So that became a big kind of country, sort of ranchero music movement called Duranguense. So I was able to capture that and go to Mexico with my former students. So that was really great. Yeah, you can hear that on NPR.
I know, I did hear some of it, and I heard some of the music.
Yeah.
It was great.
I loved it, yeah.
Yeah. Wow, this is great. So we're winding down, and I want to just get back to this, moment of asking you, do you have any advice? Do you have any things that you would like to say so that people who hear this might feel some direction, and not just about, go to our website, but like, what are some of the things like,
Sure.
Well,
sure. I would say that when it comes to kids and their racial learning, they're learning every day, who matters, right?
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of messages out there about who's worth, covering on the news or having, and in what role, and having a TV show around, and who has the better schools, and who, as we drive through neighborhoods, who has the important jobs, all of these messages that kids get, who has dolls that represent them, who gets represented in books and all of that. And whether your child is, whatever color your child is in, if we let that kind of racial hierarchy that's in the culture stand for your kid, then they're really losing out.
Yeah.
They're really losing out on being full humans, on knowing other kids. They're losing out, if they're kids of color, on knowing how to navigate, when there are those obstacles, because we can, and knowing how to take care of themselves, and avoid some of the stressors.
Yeah.
So these are all things that, so I would say pay attention to racial learning, to your kids. Talk to your kids about race, talk to your friends about race, and make it an ongoing conversation and an ongoing part of your learning. Because so much of the story of race in the US is about having our stories not told to us, hidden from us, having other people's stories. So we really need to do our work to uncover them.
The consequence of internalizing the negative.
That's right. Yeah.
So that that becomes a real force in moving forward in your life.
That's right. In internalizing the negative or the superiority.
Yes, both.
Both. Yeah. So the inferiority or superiority. So there's really there's kind of institutional, there's interpersonal, and there's internalized racism, and they're all sort of areas we need to be aware and find help for, and EmbraceRace is certainly a great place to start.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that work.
Thank you.
It's
I really appreciate being on.
very inspiring to hear more about it, and I think you guys are wonderful.
Thanks for having me on.
You're
This was really
welcome.
great, Marcie.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us today on Going Deeper Interviews, and I want to thank Greenfield Community Television for their wonderful support, and the interns, the volunteers, the staff, everyone here is so wonderful. I also want to say that if you'd like to see Going Deeper interviews, you can see them also on my website, marciesclove.com. And I recently started some podcasting, and that can be seen as Going Deeper interviews through iTunes and through Google Play. Okay, see you next time.
Well, when I was a little boy sitting on my mama's knee, well, when I was